Sorry, I haven't uploaded anything for a while. Combination of being ill, and you may still hear a little bit of raspiness in my voice, and also lost internet in the storms that came through. So we're back. So what I wanted to talk about today was a period essentially running between 1800 and 1824, kind of getting into the politics of things, how things shape up. This is an area we really don't go over a lot. It's kind of a setup talking about Andrew Jackson's election, and I'm probably going to get more into him in another video. So this is just to get a feel for how the politics shaped up to get us to the point where someone like that could ends up being president. A key factor of the era is also known as either the AB letter or the AB scandal, which factors into this. So, with the beginning of the Republic, we set up something called, and when we, it's more of a informal decision by George Washington and Congress to create what was known as the Congressional Caucus system. It was also known as the King Caucus because uh, it really um, it seemed kind of almost like a star chamber where only the most elite of the country got to make a choice on how the president was picked. And the idea, what happened was, is because at the time when Washington set things up, and it wasn't entirely his idea, it was kind of a consensus idea, was that uh, not everybody in the country knew who everybody else was in the country. Like I said, somebody who was very important in Virginia might be completely unknown in Georgia or Massachusetts. And so they figured the people who would know the best about who could be potential presidents would be Congress because this would be a group of people from all over the nation in one spot. They would meet each other, they would meet other up and coming people, they would hear about people in other states. So these people would have the most information on how to uh, essentially uh, figure out how it would work. So it was kind of considered as a stopgap, and it took a while before people decided we don't particularly like this. Um, Very often, the and part of the caucus, King Caucus, the King Caucus. The system was partially set up because of the Federalist Party's infighting as well. A lot of elections, essentially, the senators and reps would send a single recommendation back to their state. And usually, what would happen is the state legislature would look at this and they would come up with how they would decide who was going to be the electors based on who they thought the presidential candidate would be, and a lot of times the Congressional Caucus or King Caucus, their recommendation was what won out on top. Over time, it would start looking to be very elitist. It was considered very undemocratic, and eventually it would be looked at as a violation of separation of powers because the president and Congress were supposed to be very separate entities. And here you had Congress almost picking the president, almost like it was a parliamentary system, which clearly, when they wrote things up, were deliberately avoiding. Now, getting into Jackson, Jackson hated elitism. He saw it as very Hamiltonian in nature, and he was very much against the Hamiltonian system as he saw it. Uh, the Congressional Caucus system is one of the things that helped convince him to listen to calls to run for the presidency. So, a huge major impact on the early nation was the Napoleonic Wars. One of the big things that happens is uh, France sells the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. So this creates a very fluid situation economically in the U.S. We have a situation where we have lots of land, not lots of money, and the government is trying to figure out essentially how to parcel off this land and sell it in such a way that it's somewhat equitable, but also that they're getting their money back and it's a worthwhile deal. So this leads to a lot of speculation, and it creates the need for a lot of additional money because people want to invest in this land. Uh, some basically some land ventures would buy up large areas and then resell them, kind of stuff that wouldn't look too alien to us today. Another impact of the Napoleonic Wars is European agriculture is essentially wrecked by the war because you have a combination of people being called up from the fields to go fight, so they're not planting and harvesting at the levels they normally do. And especially when a country is being invaded, a lot of the farmers get called up as emergency reserves. So what ends up happening is the United States ends up selling a lot of crops overseas, making money. This would also create a situation where the banks, because what would happen is a farmer would say, gee, look how much money I made. If I had more seed, more land under cultivation, I could even make more money. And the banks would agree and say, yeah. So what they would do is they would essentially create loans to buy the next season's seed and basically try to tap into this European market. And by the way, this is something that would happen repeatedly throughout the 1800s, where Europe would go to war. The farmers would be making money and they'd say, hey, we could make a lot more money. The banks would agree. And this would kind of create this boom bust cycle that was entirely off this agricultural war cycle that would occur with Europe. And this is a lot of justification people would eventually use for the Federal Reserve. Of course, by the time the Federal Reserve came about, this whole war agriculture cycle had kind of come to an end. Another factor that comes out of the Napoleonic Wars is that there isn't enough production in Europe to meet their needs because everyone's being called up to war. So this begins the process of building industry in the United States. Essentially, we get our beginnings of our industrial revolution, creating a manufacturing boom. So this sets us up for the War of 1812. Because now they're at war, and this basically messes up trade and is impacting the economy in a negative way, both the government and the Second National Bank basically opt to take anything that even vaguely looks like money. So instead of silver and gold, they're taking specie, or excuse me, non-specie money, paper money. Essentially, it's credit generated money. And everyone kind of knows that the paper money isn't the best way to go because it's a lot of times the paper money is backed by future income, which may not be coming. But because of the war emergency, basically the banks, the central bank and the government are all basically using whatever kind of paper and silver and gold they can get their hands on. Also, of course, this creates the rise of Jackson because of the Battle of New Orleans and his dealings with the Indian invasion in the Georgia, Florida area. Uh, at this time, frontier politicians were pretty much kind of excluded from the idea of being into the elitist club of the East because he creates a big name for himself. He's one of the few people on the frontier that has enough name recognition uh, uh, across all the states where people are considering him as a possible presidential candidate. So then we get to the post war situation and what was known as the Panic of 1819. Well, the first thing that happens is the farmers of Europe go back to their fields. And so, with the war ending, the agricultural prices collapsed. And this ends up destabilizing borrowers and banks, especially ones who had loans based against the next year's crops coming in and making a certain amount of money based at the current market. Now, this doesn't just put the borrowers in a bind. It puts a lot of the banks in a bind as well because they've issued multiple layers of paper money that are essentially kind of collapsing as the undergirding future revenue is going away. Now, just to make things worse, during the end part of the war, British stockpiles from their factories started piling up because trade across the Atlantic had essentially failed due to our privateers running the seas. And so Britain basically dumped their excess stockpile of manufactured goods below cost, specifically into the American market. One reason was they wanted to clear the glut. And the second reason, and essentially British politicians admitted this openly, their goal was to completely destroy American industry so that they wouldn't be a competitor in the future. Thanks, Britain. So, with all this going on, the Second American Bank, the predecessor to the Federal Reserve, ends up tightening credit. And they start demanding repayment in specie, silver and gold. So, essentially, they've got loans scattered out through the other banks. And essentially, this pushes the banks with loans with the central bank in order to start demanding specie as well. This situation basically it did wipe out some people's savings. It caused a lot of distress. A lot of people's lives were ruined. And this incident would cause Jackson to view the central bank as a villain for the damage it caused to Western people. Now we get into what is known as the death of the Federalist Party. Well, so the Federalist Party had a lot of problems in their startup. Initially, it was just meant to be the nationalists of the country, whereas the anti-federalists were essentially non-nationalists, which were a good way of looking at things. A lot of the people who were for building the constitutional government ended up in the Federalist Party, and interestingly enough, the idea was that they weren't actually expecting to have multiple parties, and someone like Hamilton actually pushed things so far that people saw that they absolutely needed to have some kind of counterparty that ends up being the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party was very often seen as being elitist by the American population. You had the issue of the Adams and Hamiltonian factions infighting. This would last beyond Adams' presidency, and it would do a lot to damage the party's ability to govern. The Federalist Party had been initially opposed to the Louisiana Purchase, which was highly popular, especially with the Westerners. Uh, so this is something that was held against them. Because the Federalists uh, had a lot of ties to overseas trade, merchants, and other things like that, they were very quick to look at ways to create good deals for their constituents in terms of trade, and generally that meant with England. And so that made them look Anglophilic to a lot of people, which also basically soured the well on that. The other problem is the Federalist Party was very New England centric, whereas a lot of the rest of the party, the Democratic Republicans, represented a large swaths of the rest of the country. The Federalists were heavily centered in the New England area. Then comes the problem with the War of 1812. Because they were heavily centered in New England, they were heavily opposed to the war due to trade purposes, thinking this would economically ruin them, and it did to a certain extent. However, their opposition made them look very unpatriotic in a war that became more. It became a new nationalist rally point, especially when it came to the actions of Westerners. Westerners looked at the war with Britain as something the United States as a nation should be doing. So this opposition to war with Britain uh, also weighed heavily on the Federalist Party to look legitimate. Uh, and basically trying to protect merchant shipping and business made them look pro-British. Then, as the war, so basically you get a position where as the war is going along, it doesn't look like it's going that well. And the Federalists are having all kinds of problems governing, and they held what was called the Hartford Convention. Uh, and what it was they're coming up with a bunch of ways to govern more effectively and try to solidify the power of their party to give them better ability to deal with future elections. See if some of this sounds kind of familiar. I think if you want to talk about history rhyming, I see a little bit of rhyming going on. Initially, at the Hartford Convention, uh, there were threats of New England states seceding because of the war. Uh, these calls for secession eventually leaked, making the Federalist Party look really bad. The Federalist Party was talking about basically preventing their states, or basically blocking militia call-ups from their states in order to dampen the ability of Monroe to be able to fight the war. Again, this doesn't make them look good. So here's the fun part. They came up with a list of amendments, and essentially the idea was to deliver them to D.C., uh, pass the amendments in Congress, and then basically push them through to the states and see if they get these amendments tacked to the Constitution. The first thing they wanted to do was end the Three-Fifths Compromise, essentially change it so slaves count as zero. This would dramatically increase the power of New England and dramatically decrease the power of the South. So you can see how this is going to cause problems once this becomes known. They also wanted to create a constitutional amendment that required a two-thirds majority of Congress to admit new states. So the idea is they wanted to prevent new states from coming in and diluting their New England power base. They wanted the government, as also a constitutional amendment, that if the president called for embargoes, that the president could only do it for 60 days total. And that for any other kind of trade restrictions would require a two-thirds majority of Congress. They also wanted to limit presidents to one term, which was kind of the problem they were running into, is they were having trouble getting two-term presidents up. And then the next thing they wanted to do was prohibit consecutive presidents from the same state. As Virginia had produced several presidents in a row, they felt this was a problem. So therefore, they were trying to stack the deck so that the elections would be more weighted towards the New England way of looking at things. So the Hartford Convention came up with its list of demands, and essentially the demands arrived in Washington, D.C. at the same time the Treaty of Ghent arrived. And basically, so essentially, the war is over on terms that are generally pretty good for the United States. And at the exact same time, the Federalists show up with this list of whining demands saying, we can't win elections anymore, so we want to change the Constitution. And just to make things worse, shortly thereafter, Jackson's victory in New Orleans comes rolling in. So the Federalist Party really looks like a bunch of dirtbags at this point. They look like they're unpatriotic, they look like they're pro-British, and they look like they're whining about their inability to win elections and wanting to change the rules so they could make elections work their way. This results in 1816 having an electoral blowout. The Democratic Republicans got 85% of the electoral votes. Now, the sad thing is, this gentleman pictured next to me, Mr. Rufus King, was the last major Federalist Party candidate. And, you know, it is a sad thing that we never had a president named Rufus. Just my thought. So ultimately, the feds looked disloyal, unpatriotic, and out of touch. And this essentially killed them. This election was pretty much the last major showing they had. They would probably win some state seats and such in New England area, but they were pretty much done as a national party at this point. Oh, I want to talk a little bit about because this is something that came up in Jackson's biography that I've been reading, and it's something I would not have attributed to him just knowing what I did on a surface level of how he did things, but it's a good illustration of how essentially the upper class of the United States, how men like him kept in touch with the goings on of the world. And so he is probably not as educated as many of the other people in these high political positions. But even though he's got quite a lot of things going on. So initially, Jackson, his mother believed he would make a good minister, and so he was schooled in Latin and Greek. Although not fluent in it, he was able to basically follow along various things. So he was able to read a lot of the great works and understand a bunch of what was going on. Uh, his personality didn't lend well to being a minister, so he ended up becoming a lawyer, passing the Carolina bar. He was known as having a well appointed library. Essentially, people from all around the area would come to his house for various dinner parties and such. And his library was used by people almost as if it were kind of a rural adjunct library for people to use. He subscribed to between 15 and 20 newspapers from around the country, essentially covering almost all the major cities and probably a couple duplicates from some of the other cities to get a feel for, because newspapers at that time tended to break down where they were specifically geared towards the political party they backed. So there was no attempt at looking at trying to be neutral or anything like that. So you'd literally have a Federalist newspaper or a Democratic Republican newspaper. So basically, at that time, mail took about 3 to 4 weeks to arrive. So at any given time, Jackson and his peers would have a good feel for what was going on in all the major cities of the country, with at worst a month lag in the major news events. He also maintained routine correspondence between politicians and professionals around the country, including a lot of people from DC. So this would give him the ability to not only know things that are going on in these areas, but make inquiries. What does this mean? I heard this. Is it true? What do you know? And he would receive somewhere between 30 to 40 pieces of correspondence a day, most of which he responded to. So, because of this, he was well aware of the inside dealings that were going on in DC and had a really good handle on the politics of most states, despite being on the what was essentially the edge of the United States at the time. Now, all this general information he would get would lead him towards the presidency. Um, at that time, it was considered really bad taste to kind of position yourself for president. So it was generally, you were in a position where people would ask you first before you would consider it. And so essentially, a lot of people were using correspondence to set him up to become president, where they were deliberately feeding him information to try to convince him without outright asking him. So they would often give him the type of information that they believed would cause him to run. So by 1820, with the collapse of the Federalist Party, essentially the Democratic Republican Party broke into personality factions where uh, factions identified themselves by the person they backed for president. So now we want to talk about the person who should have been president, William Crawford. Ever hear of him? Probably haven't. So essentially, what happens is, and he also creates a bridge for several things that build its way to the 1820 election. So he ends up as Secretary of Treasury under two presidents. He used his position to get himself in a place to make him a front runner with the congressional caucuses. And people were basically projecting that he was almost a sure winner, or if not the 1820 election, definitely the 1824 election, because he was doing all the rounds and doing the right thing. And being positioned directly in DC, he could basically work on all the favors he needed to be in a good position with all the congressional members and leaders. That would be the type of person who could, you know, the type of people who could basically put him in the position to win. Now, as Secretary of Treasury, he ended up running a lot of these land purchases I was talking about from the Louisiana Purchase. He would run these deals for the Western banks. And because the Treasury and the bank and the national bank kind of ran separate from each other, they weren't running in. They basically had kind of separate functions. And so he was using these Western banks for two purposes. One, because they were closer to the action, but also he was essentially buying goodwill with the major political people in those areas as well, so that they would instruct their congressmen to back him for president. He did give favorable deals to connected people. Now, at that time, that wasn't considered the worst thing in the world as long as nothing blew up and it didn't look like someone had gained wealth unfairly. So, I mean, if someone, you're not going to give a big loan to somebody who's a poor dirt farmer who can't bring in crops. You're going to give people who are successful businessmen, and so that's essentially what was going on. So with all of what's going on is you have so a lot of this money flowing through the Western banks because of the shortage of money, and then because of the added problems of the War of 1812 and the agricultural boom. You have a lot of this paper money flowing around back and forth being used by the federal government to work these land deals. So when the Panic of 1819 comes in and the banks try to ratchet down and start demanding hard currency, the Western banks were destabilized far worse than a lot of the other banks. So what he did was he allowed depreciated paper to be redeemed at full value at the expense of the U.S. Treasury. Now, his actions actually helped key people by further shored up his likelihood of being the 1824 main nominee that essentially the King Caucus or the Congressional Caucus would return to the rest of their states. So we got a position where this guy uh, worked all the right people. Uh, he did a lot of stuff that helped expand land ownership out into the West. And he was a good insider inside DC, able to work the people who needed to give the recommendation from the Congressional Caucus to make him the main guy. And so he was absolutely considered a shoo-in. But obviously, we never had a President Crawford. So what happened? Well, what was known as the AB letter or the AB scandal essentially an anonymous letter, which later on we figured out who it was, but it's an anonymous letter with a lot of details alleging malfeasance on the part of Crawford. This ended up in the newspaper backed by the Calhoun faction and was printed widely in a lot of places in the United States. And this ended up triggering a congressional investigation right at the time he was at his most ascendant point. So what ends up happening is you have the situation where Crawford is doing all this wheeling and dealing, gets himself in a position to be the best choice to be picked by the Congressional Caucus. And it's right at the time the Federalist Party is collapsing and people are starting to look at the whole King Caucus as a elitist mess. So essentially, the leading contenders for the presidency attack the Congressional Caucus system as being very elitist. And unfortunately for Crawford, the caucus system is what he had cultivated, and now it was on life support. Now, ultimately, when it was all said and done, he was exonerated. They pretty much came to the conclusion that he'd actually done what the Secretary of Treasury was supposed to do. Even though it did benefit key people, it also kept a lot of banks from failing that would have, which pretty much was his part of his job. Now, the Congressional Caucus ended up picking Crawford. However, by that point, it had no more influence and power. So what ends up happening is this sets the stage for the 1820 election, which is another interesting election. So I do see some potential corollaries between certain things that happened with this period and things that happened in our own country, where we had one party that was essentially, currently, the Democrats leaned in a more globalist manner, and the Republicans, with the Trump movement, is leaning towards a more nationalist way of looking at things. And at that time, you basically had the Federalists, who were viewed as pro-British, so they weren't viewed as purely nationalistic Americans, and the Democratic Republicans took the mantle of being the nationalist party, the patriotic party. And you also see them going to extreme lengths to try to shore up the upcoming election, and it ends up blowing up in their face. We could say that maybe some of that we also saw leading up to our current 2024 election that just went past. But that's just something I'm seeing. I'm not sure if it's really there. So, comments below. Anything in here that you were completely unaware of? What do you think? Are there some rhyming of history going on here, or am I just imagining it? Feel free to tell me what you think. Please smash the like button. If you don't regularly subscribe and you caught this video and the YouTube algorithm brought it to you, check out my other titles. I get into lots of stuff. Economics, current events, history, politics, all kinds of good stuff. Consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.